it's a lot easier for someone to write a book, especially us old farts, to write a book and to explain things that way. And there are concepts that are just really, really hard to get across any other way. And if those are the concepts that you're interested in, if those are things that you think you need to know or you want to expand your mind, I don't know of a medium that's better.
Hey everyone, welcome to Book Overflow. This is the podcast for software engineers by software engineers, where every week we read one of the best technical books in the world in an effort to improve our craft. I am Carter Morgan, and I am joined here, as always, with my co-host, Nathan Toops. How are you doing, Nathan?
Doing great. Hey, everybody.
Well, fantastic. This is a special episode of Book Overflow. We don't promise we'll have them every week, but we like when we do. This episode, we interview Carl Brown of the YouTube channel Internet of Bugs. If you're not familiar with Carl, one, check out his YouTube channel, Internet of Bugs. Fantastic content there. He went semi-viral, about as viral as you can in the software engineering niche, for his takedown of Devon AI and some of the misleading advertising claims there. Fantastic video. I loved it. And then we had the idea for the collaboration because he actually also did a video reviewing John Ousterhout's A Philosophy of Software Design. So he was kind enough to come on the podcast and discuss his favorite books with us. Nathan, how do you feel about this interview?
It was awesome. I always love a good hot take and a good contrarian hot take. And Carl doesn't pull punches. He's also super sincere and really fun to talk to. I think you'll see that in this episode. Again, our backlog keeps getting filled up with all these great guests that we have, and Carl's no exception. This has been really cool.
Yes, this is as thorough an advertisement as you could possibly have for being well-read. You can tell that Carl is an incredibly intelligent man, and a lot of his foundational knowledge comes from the books he's about to share with us. So please stick around for the whole episode. This is Carl Brown sharing his favorite books on software engineering. Well, hey, Carl, thanks for being here with us today.
Thanks for having me.
Well, absolutely. Well, Carl, why don't you explain to our viewers, we're going to talk a lot about your favorite books and kind of why you're such a voracious reader, but why don't you explain to us just a bit about who you are, why you started your channel, for anyone who maybe isn't familiar.
So I have been a computer professional since 1989, so this is my 35th year. Back when I started, so I graduated from college in 93, which was the year that NCSA Mosaic launched, which was the first cross-platform browser. So when I was learning to program, there was no such thing as Stack Overflow or mostly the internet or any of that kind of stuff, right? So books were how we used to do things back then, right? So I just kind of got used to doing that and have done it before. I wrote my own book at one point, although it's out of print now. So I started the channel because so I have a college freshman. I'm the father of the college freshman. And when I got pounced on one time because there was a conversation in which it came out that, oh, I have a father that's a, professional computer programmer. And there was this tons and tons and tons of questions about, is AI going to take all of our jobs? Are we still going to have a job when we graduate? My parents are all freaked out because they've spent all this money on college and they don't know if I'm going to have a job. And I was like, okay, don't worry about it. I'll write up a couple blog posts. You can send it to them. They'll be fine. I got, Dad, no one my age will ever find or read your blog. So, we went back and forth a little bit and I was like, okay, fine. I'll make a YouTube video. You can point people at that, and then maybe I'll have as many subscribers as there are, members of your computer club. And not long after that, the Devon, the first AI software engineer, got launched supposedly, and then that product launched on a particular day that I was already working on a video about why AI was never going to be a true software engineer, and so I just kind of rolled that into my video. And for the first 24, 48 hours on YouTube, it was just their videos and then mine. And so that's what kind of put me on the map. And then about 3 weeks later, I took one of their demo videos and was like, yeah, this is what they said it did. This is what it actually did. And then that one kind of exploded. So that's kind of how I ended up where I am now.
I saw your Devin video. I think that's how I first encountered your channel and appreciated it. We read on the podcast, What is ChatGPT Doing and Why Does It Work by Stephen Wolfram. And there's so much hype around AI. It was really nice to dig into a bit into why it works and how it works. And that was one of our big takeaways from it, was kind of like, I don't know if this thing is going to replace all of us. And, is this thing really truly intelligent? And so seeing someone kind of put Devin in its place was cathartic on my end.
Yeah.
So
I love a contrarian hot take. That was, so it's like, I keep coming back for more.
Contrarian is might as well be my middle name lately. So
yeah, you have, you've read some of the books that we've read. You've read A Philosophy of Software Design. I know that.
Right here.
We have not touched clean code yet. I know you have at least one video on clean code.
Not a fan, but
well, so we want to hear about all the different kind of books you have. You said that you kind of started out, there wasn't really Stack Overflow, and so you just start out reading books. Do you think there's still a place for reading software engineering books in a world of large language models and Stack Overflow?
So yes and no. So we used to have, I've got some back there. So we used to have like reference books, right? So I've got like the JavaScript Bible. I have a PostScript reference book. I've got a bunch of that kind of stuff. None of that makes any sense to be in paper form anymore, right? So if you want to know what the current status of, the arguments for a particular function, go online. We don't need a book for that anymore. But there are a lot of less fiddly code stuff and more like philosophical and more conceptual ideas that I think are still best driven by long form reading. And I've struggled off and on trying to get some of those ideas across in a video format and haven't had the best success compared to, some of the like book chapters kind of thing. So that's still a work in progress. There are still concepts that I'm like, that video just didn't seem to come across. I'm not going to post that. I'm not sure how to get that idea across. So that's still a work in progress for me.
You've captured the ethos of our podcast pretty well, where we do try to stick away from like reference material. We've had some people be like, "Hey, I wrote a C# Azure DevOps book. Do you want to check it out?" I'm like, "We're sure it's great, but we're trying to cover things that are, a little more timeless." Right. And so that's I don't know, Nathan, would you agree that's kind of how we feel, that that's maybe where you should be focusing your reading these days?
Yeah, I mean, I thought it was, we're looking for like what we're calling long tail content right now, right? Like there's so many foundational books that we want to cover. I mean, maybe we'll branch out in the future, but there's so many. Our backlog's very long of foundational type books.
I'll see if I can add a couple today.
Absolutely. Awesome. We had the discussion when we started the podcast. We're like, are we just going to run out of books one day?
No.
Like books work? No, we will never, ever.
I don't know if you can see behind me. These shelves wrap from right here all the way around this side of my office. Although that shelf right there is fiction. So,
well, I mean, with that, why don't you, this listeners, this format is we ask guests to come on and just share with us their favorite books. And so Carl has come prepared with a mountain of books to talk about. Yeah. So Carl, why don't you start with, Mythical Man-Month.
Okay. Is my video reversed?
No. We can see it. It looks right on our end. Yeah.
Because it's showing the wrong thing to me, and it's like, well, if you want to read the title, it's gonna be a problem. Okay. So this is the 20th anniversary edition, which came out in '95, which was a couple of years after I got out of school. This is one of the seminal works on not necessarily the programming part of programming, but the like project management part of programming. So this is the first place I ever heard of Conway's Law, which is one of the most important computer principles that I've ever dealt with when it comes to groups and stuff. The essay for Conway's Law is not in here, but there's an essay that specifically references it. There are two interesting essays in here that I think you guys have referenced at one point in time. One of them is called Build One to Throw Away.
Yeah.
And another one, which is kind of the flip side of that, is called the second system effect, which is basically the tendency when you build the first thing and you get it working, and then you're like, okay, now this time it's going to be really cool. And then you like build something that's like so crazy over engineered that you might as well have, so it's in here. The Mythical Man-Month, which is the titular essay, is all about why, 9 women can't have a baby in a month. The Brooks Law, the author of this, coined his the most concise version of it I've heard is basically adding more programmers to a late project makes it later. And it's all about how bringing a new person up to speed slows things down. And the more people you have, the slower things get because the more communication there is. So this is not a, you could do this in one episode kind of thing, even though it's probably only 200 pages, 250 pages. But this one, if you're going to do this one, take your time, because each of the essays in this have a lot of meat in them. No Silver Bullet by the guy that wrote C++ is in here, which is basically there's no magic, to making computers programming just work. That, as far as I'm concerned, includes AI, but that's a whole different conversation.
How has this book affected you and your career? What's made it stick with you because it's an older book. So why is it stuck with you? It's a very older
book. So the interesting thing about it is, so most of the stuff from it, from what I understand, was conceived and written around the time that like one of the, I think OS 360, one of the really old mainframe OSs from the like early 70s. Was being built, and the learnings from that informed a lot of this. The fascinating thing is, here we are, 50 years later, not quite, and maybe 50 years later, and the vast majority of the stuff in there holds up really, really well, which is kind of shocking. But a lot of it is about, and this is kind of a theme, a lot of it is more about the people and about the communications and about the human cognitive brain load than it is about the actual bits and the typing and the syntax of the languages, right? And as much as we've gotten faster processors, and as much as we've gotten more concise languages and faster languages, and learned about, computer created concepts like object-oriented and that kind of stuff that didn't exist back then, the human brain hasn't actually changed that much, right? And so a lot of the limitations that existed because humans are still there, and not recognizing that and trying to work with it and around it instead of against it is like beating your head against a wall. And so it's really surprising to me how often the essays in there are still relevant, and how often people, especially folks that have come of age in the last, who have started programming in the last, 10 or 20 years, have no idea about most of those lessons, and end up getting to relearn them, which is interesting. Sometimes the hard way.
No, I like what you hit on there, which is anything having to deal with sort of the human brain is going to have a bit of a longer shelf life, right? We talk about that kind of in the context of even social media, which is like, we have not evolved to handle this radically new way of interacting with the world. This is, my wife and I just recently read The Anxious Generation by Jonathan Haidt, and really enjoyed that one. There's a lot of interesting stuff there too. Nathan, did you have any? Great. Nathan, you have any questions about that one?
This reminds me, it sounds really weird, but the NSA has a YouTube channel, and they just released a Grace Hopper lecture from like 1982 on what she worries about in the future of data and machines. And it is timeless. First of all, I've never heard Grace Hopper speak before. And that was, she was already very far into her career at that point, because she was doing stuff back in World War II. But it was these like very principle oriented, and it was like, oh, this is as important today as it was in 1982 when they were trying to solve these problems. So that's really cool. I can't wait. We have this in our backlog. I think we should be hitting up this book relatively soon. I'm excited.
It keeps coming up.
Yeah.
The more it comes up, the
it's
more
been on my
it gets bumped
to-do
up.
list forever. I know of it. I know it's infamous, and I know it's had a huge influence. And so that's really awesome. So I'm glad you started with that.
Yes, I love that one.
Well,
I figured,
Carl.
I figured next we would talk about the Ousterhout philosophy of software design, because you specifically said you wanted to talk about this one because you had done an episode on that.
Absolutely.
Just for cred, real quick, this book I got back in the 90s, I think. I didn't actually realize until I saw your interview with him that he was the same guy that wrote TCL and TK. So I was really surprised. TCL and TK was amazing back in the late 90s, early 2000s. I don't know if you do anything with Lua or know anything about Lua, but it was kind of the Lua of back then.
Yes.
It was a great way for you to embed a scripting language or some kind of control language into your C programs because it linked really well. And so there were lots and lots and lots of different ways that we would take that, embed it inside of stuff, and then be able to use Tickle to create and to mess with stuff that was running without inspect variables and that kind of thing without having to actually, stop things and do the debugger and all that kind of stuff. So it was incredibly useful, even aside from what it was intended to do.
By far our biggest surprise of this podcast is that the authors just respond to our emails, and that we just emailed John and we're like, hey, we love the book. Can we talk to you about it? And to our great surprise, he said yes. So John is really fantastic. If you haven't seen our interview with John Ousterhout, please check it out. Yeah, it's great. So you've read A Philosophy of Software Design. Mm-hmm. We really liked the book. What are your thoughts? And I know you had, like you said, contrarian is a bit of a part of the brand of your channel.
Yes. So there were big chunks of it that I liked. Especially, I'm a big fan of documentation and writing documentation in the code as you're writing the code. I've got a whole video that's got a lot of that in it. And that's even more important these days if you're trying to use like a GitHub Copilot or that kind of thing. Because once you write this is a function that's going to do X, and then Copilot will start auto-completing stuff for you. So it actually speeds things up a lot to do that. It's more useful than I ever thought it was back in the day. So that stuff is all great. The things that bothered me, so there was a chapter, I think it's 19, which is basically kind of an overview of stuff. And it spends like 2 pages on Agile, and it spends like 2 pages on automated testing. And I'm like, okay, either don't bother, right? Or actually do those topics justice, because 2 pages on Agile is just ridiculous. But the problem is, well, maybe not the problem, but he's actually got some interesting things to say about Agile, and he's actually got some interesting things to say about testing, but he doesn't actually spend any time expanding on any of those, so it's not actually useful. You know what I mean? Yep. It's like a flag that says, hey, there might be a dragon here, but then no understanding of the dragon or what you're going to get bit by or whether it breathes flame or what. So that chapter kind of, I was like, but the one that really, really bugged me was chapter 10, which was the chapter on error handling.
Oh, interesting.
And I know in the, and I mean, that's on brand for me, right? I'm Internet of Bugs, right? I'm one of those people. So early in my career, I did what we then called sysadmin and network admin. They became DevOps and kind of platform engineering, although that's slightly different. Although I did what we call now software engineering, platform engineering back before it was platform engineering. So one of the things that I've been that a lot of software developers have not been is the person whose pager goes off at 2 o'clock in the morning and has to drag themselves out of bed and go fix whatever the heck it is that went wrong, right? And a lot of software developers that I've worked with have never had that experience and are a lot more cavalier with, okay, that's never going to happen than I am. And that frustrates me to no end. But the error handling chapter, so one thing that was awful is he used, I know he, from the interview, that he wished he could go back and get rid of the error masking. He said if there was one thing he would change, it was the making errors, hiding errors and making them go away, because he was finding his students were having problems with that. And that was one of the big chunks that was like awful. But the example of that he used was a network protocol called NFS, which I don't think either of you are probably old enough that you ever really used it in real life. I
am, but yes.
I'm a little younger,
no. You might be old enough, but have you actually ever used it?
I used Amazon's implementation of it called EFS.
Yeah, that's not the same.
Okay.
Yeah, so Amazon's implementation of it is basically just here, we're taking the wire protocol.
Okay.
Right. And we're re-implementing the wire protocol so that way, if you've got something that already speaks NFS, we can attach to it. Right. But that's as close as they actually get to how NFS actually worked. What NFS basically did is it said, we're not going to deal with the idea of something happened to the server. Right. We're going to go talk to the server and we're going to block until the server answers. And if the server catches on fire, we will be blocked until ever. Right. I mean, there's no, and what that meant was every single frickin' program that needed to talk to NFS either had no error recovery from that or had to write their own bespoke one-off version of something went wrong. And so now I have to deal with it. Right. And it was such a nightmare for all of us that were in the system administration back then, because like the file server would occasionally crash and it would occasionally reboot. And basically the entire building would just have these scrolling up, NFS server not responding, NFS server not responding, NFS server not responding. All the phones would go off. Everybody would be screaming, and people would have work that was like lost. Right. It's like it's in memory on the client. Right. It's just waiting to be able to write it to the server. But the server's not there. The server reboots. The file handles are different now. It can't rewrite it to the thing that it used to be written to. It's in memory, but there's no way you can possibly save it. You're done. You've lost it. Right. That stuff just drove me crazy. So using that as an example of how to do error handling, I was livid. That was just awful. But the other thing is, I'm a huge fan of using unit test, not just unit test, but often unit test frameworks, the N units and the J units and the, all that kind of stuff, to build what we would call integration tests. Right. And so I go as end to end as I can. I say, okay, so I'm going to mock the network and bring in stuff that pretends to be network packets. And I mock the screen and I mock what users are clicking on. And I sometimes mock disks. But everything in the middle, I'm actually running end to end as much as I can. Right. And then I force situations to happen that cause errors. And I make sure that those errors get handled correctly. Because one of the most interesting lines in this book, in this book, is that there was a study that said that something like, I'm going to butcher this because I don't have it right in front of me, but basically 90% of all software disasters, or I forget which word they used, were due to poor error handling code. And what happens is most error handling code in most actual software in the world doesn't get run very often. So it doesn't get tested very often. And a lot of times people are like, well, that's never going to happen, that kind of thing. And there are two problems with that. One of them is that the internet is not static, right? And it is often the case that something that never shows up in the lab, because of something that's different on the internet than it is in your lab or your test environment, causes that thing that you think is never going to happen to actually happen. But the other half of that, which is worse, is that there are times that bad actors intentionally cause that situation in order to try to take advantage of your bad error handling code so they can hack the system and they can get data and they can do all kinds of, or even just, DDoS you for fun, right? And so even when it's true that under normal circumstances that would never happen, the internet is not under normal circumstances.
Right.
Right. So forcing that error code to get run, as far as I'm concerned, is vitally important. It's not considered to be as important in the vast majority of the groups as I think it should be. But in my mind, saying 90% of problems are due, 90% of real computer outages are due to error handling code, but I'm not really going to talk to you about how to really handle error handling code, just rubbed me the wrong way.
I really like what you're talking about, error handling, and what you mentioned about how, in your experience, there are software engineers, a lot of software engineers, more than you think, who don't have like an on-call rotation and aren't actually responsible for when stuff hits the fan. Because that's actually something that I've changed my tune on. As I worked at a big cloud provider, and we had to have an on-call rotation. And if the product went down you are on the hook for fixing it. And I become a little crotchety about it when people will, they'll grouch about like, I have to be on call, or why don't we have a DevOps, like some sort of operations team that handles this? And I'm like, no, this is part of being a software engineer. It's just being responsible for the stuff you write.
Right. But even most of the people these days that have a pager rotation, they're generally not the first line of defense, right? Usually the first person that sees it is some, operations person, and only if it gets escalated to a development person do you actually have to deal with it, right? I've spent a lot of time doing startup stuff, and I've spent a lot of time doing consulting stuff, but especially in the startup world, when there are 5 people in the company, congratulations, I'm getting paged, right? Because there is nobody else.
Yeah.
Right. And so you spend a lot of time in that kind of environment, and you get a lot more sensitive to it. Especially when, little things like, one bad outage and the whole company can't make payroll next month. So you get to the point where you start caring about that a lot more than a lot of people do, especially if you're only 3rd-tier support, and most of the time you don't actually get paged in the first place.
Absolutely. Well, you've told us a lot about all of the things that maybe disagreed with in the book. Is there anything you liked from the book? We can't leave John hanging. No.
So one of the things I loved, which actually ties into these 2 books.
Oh, perfect.
If you can see both of those. This is Advanced Programming in the Unix Environment by W. Richard Stevens, and TCP/IP Illustrated Volume 1 by W. Richard Stevens. W. Richard Stevens was great. Unfortunately, he's left us. But these are books on this is basically by example how all the Unix system calls work with sample code and all that kind of stuff, right? And this is by example how TCP/IP stuff works. Right, it's got some NFS in it, but it's mainly like how HTTP works and how Telnet works. Well, you don't even know what Telnet is anymore; they don't ship it anymore. But how, sorry,
I still use Telnet sometimes. So.
Okay, so how we don't really do FTP. SSH might be in here. If not, it's in the next edition. But basically, the thing that I tell people is, and this actually does tie into John's book, that TCP/IP and Unix have eaten the world. And aside from a very small chunk of the world that still runs actual Windows, the vast majority of your phones and your servers and all that kind of stuff runs some variant of Unix that runs POSIX and runs the same basic APIs. Right. And so the way that the philosophy of software development books, there were several chapters in there that basically did compare and contrast between the really obtuse and silly, in my opinion, Java, like how do you read to and write from files APIs, compared to how Unix does it, right, was a fantastic set of examples about, okay, look, this is, if the way that Java did like file I/O was the way that Unix did file I/O, chances are something else would have won, right? Because back when I was getting started in all of this, we had TCP/IP, but we also had IPX, we had DECnet, we had a bunch of other network protocols. They have pretty much all gone away now because TCP/IP was so much better for so many different reasons. And studying how do those APIs work? What are the things that are important? How did they abstract things? What abstractions did they use? How did that work? Understanding how those things happened will make you understand how it is that you can design an API that's useful enough to other people that can really take over the world, right? And it can, in a competitive market, basically beat everybody else. So that is like a fantastic set of object lessons that you can go through. That's basically, what's the best. Now, not everybody writes APIs that way, right? It's kind of more of a, if the code you write is intended to be consumed by somebody else, maybe in a different group in your company, especially when you're writing, like I spent a year and a half inside IBM's cloud group. So we were writing code that IBM's customers consumed when they talked to our cloud, right? And so when you're working with APIs, especially APIs that external customers or external people or, open source people or whatever are going to be consuming, understanding what those APIs ought to be and having good examples of those, in my opinion, is incredibly, incredibly helpful. So that was my favorite part of that whole book, aside from the specific jabs that it took at some of the clean code stuff that drove me crazy too. So that was useful. And I should say, we talked about clean code a little bit, but basically, I want to say the thing I hate the most about clean code is not really clean code. Most of the people, or not the book Clean Code, most of the people that I know that I've talked to who advocate the principles in clean code, when you dig into it, haven't actually read the book.
Interesting.
What they have done, and actually, if you look at, like, if you read, it's over there, Cracking the Code interview, or
Yes.
Cracking the Coding interview, right? There are a bunch of stuff in that book that's basically effectively excerpts from clean code and some of the other, Martin Fowler kind of things that are being basically taken out of context to become, the things that you have to answer correctly on an interview, which means everybody takes them as gospel, even though a lot of times they're either out of context or they're out of date or they don't matter or that kind of stuff. But the amount of arguing that I've had to do with people who, like, I refuse to let any program any method in our code base be longer than my screen, right? Those people drive me crazy. And I had a project where basically I ended up having to rewrite our storage layer completely, because the storage layer we had originally was basically a SQLite based thing, and it was not thread safe. But the problem is, once you take all of your code logic and you chop it up into 10-line chunks, it's really impossible to keep track of what thread you're supposed to be on or what thread you started on, right? Because now you're 8 or 10 or 12 call stacks deep, methods deep in the call stack, and you don't know what thread you were called on seven levels of the stack ago. And so it was just trying to make that code work in a single-threaded environment, in a not thread-safe environment, was just a nightmare. And I ended up having to throw out the SQLite-based thing and write a thread-safe storage model just so that we could get past that part of the project. And that was a perennial nightmare kind of thing. The way he says, basically, classitis is what you get when you chop everything up into tiny, tiny little pieces, and then it's impossible to follow anything, or at least, it's a lot harder to follow anything. I loved that bit too, but that seemed like it was an intentional jab at the clean code philosophy.
You are not the first person to pick up that on a philosophy of software design being, in a lot of ways, a rebuttal to clean code. We are going to explore that space further on the podcast, so listeners, stay tuned. You mentioned Unix, and there was a bit of hubbub on Twitter about this recently. How important do you think it is for a modern software engineer to be very well versed in Unix?
So that's an interesting question. So let me grab these two. Okay, so these are the first and second editions of Sun Performance and Tuning. So this is back when Unix had its own, every vendor had their own version of Unix and that kind of thing. These books are basically all about what commands, things like netstat and commands that you can run on a Unix system, what those numbers actually mean and how to use that to figure out whether your code is performing well or not, or that kind of thing, right? In my old world, it was vitally important for programmers to actually, for somebody on the team to really have a thorough understanding of how Unix worked, right? And it was very important that there was at least enough communication between the people that actually understand how Unix worked and the people that were actually doing the coding, right? So they didn't have to be all in the same person, but you at least had to be able to have a conversation so that we could change this part of the code so that it could make this performance better. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
There are two things these days. One is everybody is so much more specialized. And two, so much of the stuff has moved off the server and into the cloud. So a lot of the stuff early on, you don't actually need to know anymore. But then what happens is somebody comes to you from finance, or to somebody, your boss or somebody in your group from finance, and says, why the heck is our cloud bill so high? Right? And then it turns out that it does matter how well your stuff performs. Right. And it does matter, all of that, big order, order in stuff that you have to know in your interviews, but you don't usually normally have to deal with. That kind of stuff matters in those kinds of cases. Right. Now, when it does matter in those kinds of cases, I suggest you go grab the algorithm book, which I have several of, as opposed to like trying to wing it based on what you read in cracking the coding interview. There needs to be somebody in your distributed team that understands how the Unix stuff actually works and how to performance tune it and how to reduce your costs and that kind of thing. How important it is for you to be able to do that, you individual viewer to this, is a function of what positions and what jobs you want to be able to be qualified for. If you want to be employee 5 of a startup and you're a developer, you need to know that, right? If you want to have a freelance business on the side, right? If you want to have a side hustle that you might be able to turn into your own company at some point, you need to know that, right? If all you ever want to do is be, a cog in a machine at a big cloud provider, then you probably don't ever need to know that. And you can probably even get promoted up to, SDE4 without having to know that, because most of the SDE4s that I've met don't. Most of the high level principal engineers in the cloud providers that I've worked with, the folks that actually understand all of that are more on the ops side than on the development side.
Interesting. I like you breaking it out there, because that's what I saw on Twitter. Just a lot of like, Lenny, it's absolutely ridiculous if you're a software engineer and you don't know this stuff. And like I'm not disagreeing. It's something that is one of the reasons I enrolled in my master's degree, is because that was one of the blind spots I felt like I had, was operating systems. And I was like, I really got to dig a bit more into like how this is working at a lower level. But I think you're right. Like, there are a lot of, like, for example, a front-end dev. You can be a really talented, skillful front-end dev working on a big project that 99% of Americans use every day, and not really need to have a super in-depth understanding of how the Linux API calls work.
My background before I got into software stuff was as a systems administrator, and before that, it was just doing Linux hacking stuff. I think the first project was there's this NSLU2. It's a little printer server that somebody was able to put you could put like a lightweight Linux kernel on it and, root it and do all kinds of fun stuff. And that was like the first time I was like dealing with network protocols. And I ended up like, it was really fun for me and another friend to sort of like really dive into that world. And the time I spent working in Linux stuff and then also in the network level stuff gave me a foundation that I've also noticed that, like, I talk about the bits flowing over the wire and a lot, and thinking about how like the actual physical infrastructure functions and how the operating system interacts. And you don't need to be in that all the time, but when you do, you really need to know it.
Right.
And so, yeah, otherwise it's like a mystery, right?
Yeah. And going back to this TCP/IP Illustrated Volume 1, the great thing about this series, so I learned on a series called Comer, which is back there, which was awful, especially by comparison. This book, the great thing about this series is that it introduces you to every piece of TCP/IP, to HTTP, to, whatever. Every new protocol it introduces, the first thing it shows you is this is what you would see if you looked at the packets on the wire.
Cool.
Right. So it's basically the output of like a TCP dump or that kind of thing. And then it uses that to basically jump off of and explain to you how everything works. And I have found it over and over and over again in my career that it's great to be able to say, okay, I don't know what's going on in this. And we'll talk about why I keep doing that in a minute. But I don't know what's going on in this. But what I can do is I can inspect what's coming in the wire. Right. And I can watch what's coming in and I can watch what's going out. And from a black box perspective, I can understand kind of what's going on. And then that gives me a context that I can start drilling into things. The reason that I spend a lot of time kind of jumping to my next topic with code that I don't understand is I've spent a lot of time as a consultant. I've spent a lot of time doing what I call project rescues, basically people that outsourced their project to, India or Eastern Europe. It was mostly India back in like 2001 to 2003. Lately, there's been a lot of Pakistan, whatever. It's not necessarily the case. I'm not saying that overseas programmers are necessarily bad, but the process of outsourcing stuff to people in 11 time zones away is necessarily problematic. And a lot of times, even if those programmers are incredibly competent, and they're not often, largely because all those environments tend to have incredible amounts of turnover for various economics reasons that I can go into, but you probably don't care. But that causes those projects not to do as well as if you had a team that was close to the product managers and close to the people that wanted to get things built, that was in the same time zone, that had better communication, where that team stayed and not, everybody in that team turned over 3 times by the time the project was done. So I've spent a lot of time basically coming into projects that got outsourced to the lowest bidder. And then they decided, oh, okay, we need somebody to clean this up. And then I was on one of the teams that came and cleaned that up. Right. And I'm expecting that here in a couple of years, maybe less, maybe a little more, there's going to be quite a bit of time that some of us are going to be coming in to clean up a bunch of stuff that AIs wrote, because a lot of people are giving stuff to AIs now, and they don't realize that the code they're going to get is mostly crap. And then only after it gets out there and the customers will get upset about it, are we going to have to go clean it up? Because that's basically what happened when everybody started doing the offshoring thing in 2001, 2002. When I was in school, my degree is actually in physics, but I paid for college by working in the computer lab at the university. And at first it was like a help desk where, people would print stuff and it wouldn't come out right. And it'd be like, okay, you use spaces instead of tabs. Let me show you how that works, that kind of thing. Let me change the paper in the printer, that kind of stuff. By the time I left the university, every computer lab, every PC lab that didn't belong to a particular department was something that was eventually rolled up to me. And so I knew how to program because I'd been programming on this, on the side, but I didn't do any programming education really. I had a computational physics class and a AI Lisp class that was complicated. But most of the computer stuff I've learned has all been, self-taught. And I came up through the sysadmin ranks because that's what the professional experience I had when I got into college. I really wanted to go to grad school in physics. I looked at how much debt I was already in. I looked at how much debt I was going to be by the time I got done with my PhD. I decided, okay, I'll go do this computer thing for a while. I'll pay off my student loans. I'll save up a nest egg, and then I'll go back to school. And it's been 35 years, so that's probably not going to happen now. But I've spent a lot of time, and I was going to show you these things. So you had said something, I think, on a previous podcast about consulting stuff. So this is Free Agent Nation. Which is a not computer specific book, but it's basically about the world that we're coming into from an economic standpoint, where more and more people have side hustles and more people are being considered, independent contractors and that kind of stuff, right? And kind of how to navigate that world, which is really interesting. It's, for the record, it's really nice being able to have a side gig, and then when things go on, it's like that's got some amount of, maybe this is what this podcast is going to be for you guys, but like where with stuff that's going on at work, you've got kind of a backstop of at least some income coming in. That's kind of cool. I
don't want to brag, but the YouTube channel was just monetized, and we have made $2.79 so
congratulations.
Far.
So this is the Computer Consultant's Guide. It's a little dated, but it's still pretty good. And it's basically, this was really helpful to me when I was working for computer consulting companies, which is like I started with a company called EDS, which, if you're old enough to remember when H. Ross Perot ran for president against George H.W. Bush and Bill Clinton,
92.
He made all of his money. He founded EDS, Electronic Data Systems. So that was the company that I started to go to work for that was my first job out of college. So it was useful to me when I was just part of a consulting team, but it's also got a bunch of stuff in it when you want to do freelance kinds of stuff. But specifically, if you're interested in doing freelance stuff, either directly or on the side, getting started in consulting is a really good, not computer specific, but a really good, what do you want to do about, it's state to state stuff, right? So, Colorado, Utah might be a little different. I'm in Texas. But there's stuff about, how you get started, how you find clients, that kind of stuff, what you do, the contract stage, how you negotiate prices, all that kind of stuff. So this is a really handy if you're interested in doing freelance stuff, either directly or on the side. And if you end up in the situation that's unfortunate, but sometimes actually ends up being better for you, where, you get laid off, your group gets killed, nothing against you, but we're closing your whole department, right? We don't need, we decided to outsource that function or whatever, right? Being able to say, okay, cool, let me grab, let me grab something, or let me have, knowledge already, and let me go do a freelance thing while I'm looking for a job, can be really useful and really handy on keeping your family fed.
Are you full-time freelance at this point?
I am what I call semi-retired. So okay. I have done many startups. I am in my mid-50s. I have had several exits. I've never founded my own startups, but I've had, equity in several of them. There is a world in which I never have to work again because I have enough money. There is a different world in which I get sick and have to spend time in a nursing home, and all of my retirement money goes away in a month, right?
Interesting.
So
yeah.
It's like, it's really hard to know, right? So I might be able to retire at this point, or medical circumstances might make me whatever. So I'm not, I have right at the moment, I have like a half-time client. I'm doing the YouTube thing. I have been working on a book, but that book might end up turning into just getting serialized on the YouTube channel or something else. I don't know, but it's on like software testing and quality stuff. But I guess that would be another book I should probably plug. So this is the book that I wrote. It's not really for you guys. So the original...
This is app accomplished for our
it's
audio
app
listeners?
accomplished. It's out of print, but you can still sometimes get it on Kindle. I don't know. It comes in and out of the Kindle store. It is not for programmers. The original title that I pitched was basically how not to get robbed by your mobile development contractor. And some versions of it had a different word than robbed. But it was back when the big mobile boom was hitting, and I was rescuing so many projects where people had, given a bunch of money to somebody who was, who basically just took their money and walked away, gave them code that barely compiled. And then they were like, well, what should I have done to keep from this happening? And that's how this book ended up coming about. So it's more for like the entrepreneurs or the managers that are going to be bringing in an outsourced group and working with and managing them. So it's got some project management stuff. It's got some, that kind of thing. So it's not
tell
really
whoever at the publisher who wouldn't let you name it "How Not to Get Robbed by Your Mobile Contractor." So, because that's a great title. This is Addison Wesley. So this is the same. Actually, one of my favorite things. Oh, it's in the stack there. But one of my favorite things is this is the same publisher as actually a bunch of these books, but as the Mythical Man-Month. Oh, cool. And my last name is Brown, and his last name is Brooks. And there were a lot of bookstores in which they got shelved right next to each other, and that was like a big highlight for me. I love that. That's awesome.
But no, what happened was, so this book ended up, they were in the process of making a series of business books about development. And the first book in that series was called Pitch Perfect. And it was basically how to take your app or your SaaS product, a software as a service product, and pitching it to bloggers and pitching it to press and like getting press releases for it and getting coverage of it and how to make it go viral and that kind of thing. And so they decided that all of the titles in that series were going to have two-word alliterative titles. So Pitch Perfect and then App Accomplished and all that kind of stuff. So it was basically, and then I think there was one more book after this in the series, then they discontinued the series. So anyway, it probably would have had better, done better that way. The other thing is this book is this is crazy. This book is placed in Amazon with iTunes Music.
What?
Because so the publisher has their categories of what kind of book is this, and those categories map to the categories that Amazon has. And at the time that this book got published, they did not have a category for mobile apps. So it ended up the category they put it in their system mapped to the category in Amazon that was basically MP3 music, the
That's
iTunes
so weird.
music store. So it probably would have sold a little better if it had actually had, if it had been in a category that was the least bit relevant to it. Okay.
How do you like doing freelance? Because you've worked at some big companies before, but now are doing a lot of freelance stuff. I
really like it. I consider myself to be effectively always freelance. So I consider myself working from project to project. Right. I am not the kind of person that's going to be working on the same code base for 10 years in a row. I would get bored and I would go crazy. So from my point of view, I go in and I build things. When I get done building a thing, if there's something else to get built or there's something, a big change that needs to get made to the thing, then that's cool. I will go in and do rescues. I will go in and we really want to change direction, but I'm not going to just, take tickets and do maintenance and that kind of thing. Right. So I think of it kind of like a movie studio kind of thing where I go in for a project when I get done. Sometimes I'm an employee, sometimes I'm a freelancer, sometimes I'm a consultant. Doesn't really matter to me. And then when I get done building the thing I wanted to build, if there's more for me to build there, then I might stay there. And if not, then I'll go find something else. There's a section over there that's the how to live with ADHD section. Which probably is somewhere relative to that. I got diagnosed during COVID, so in the last 4 or 5 years, because I have a child that got diagnosed with ADHD during COVID. Because it turns out it's a lot easier to pay attention in class than when you're staring at a laptop screen. Yeah. And then as a parent, I'm like, I'm educating myself on this thing that my child has been diagnosed with, and it was like, oh yeah, that sounds familiar. Oh yeah, that sounds familiar. Oh yeah, that sounds familiar. So all this stuff that I've been compensating for all of these years, I finally had a label for it. So I'm now trying to merge the things that I've always done just to keep myself sane and to keep myself on track with the best practices for this condition that I now know that I have, and it's been interesting. But yeah, the wanting to bounce from project to project may be is often an ADHD symptom. So that might have something to do with it.
Well, it's funny. I have an uncle who actually works for Disney. He's what they call an Imagineer, who they build the rides, right? And I was just chatting with him the other week, and he was talking about just how interesting it is between our industries. Because I was telling him, like, yeah, if you've been at a tech company for like 5 years, like that's considered like a long tenure. And he was saying like that's crazy to him because like it takes them 5 years to build a project, and so that's considered a very short tenure over there. But I think that attitude of living project to project is probably a really healthy one in this industry. One, because it can be a volatile industry, and you can detach yourself from your employer a bit in case you wind up getting laid off. But two, that probably promotes a good growth mindset, because I know there are some people who just, that's the dream, is to get to the one code base that they know and maintain it for 20 years, but you'll atrophy.
Yep. So speaking of which, so this is the Pragmatic Programmer.
Yes.
Both the original version and the 20th anniversary version. I'm actually have a video coming out in the next couple of days about a chapter on code generation that was in this book that got taken out of this book, and how livid I am about that. And then this book is called My Job Went to India and All I Got Was This Lousy Book. And this is a more specific version, but basically what all three of these books have in common is the idea of managing a programming career, right? And understand that the thing that you guys do for a living did not exist when I started my career, right? And a lot of what I've been spending my time on lately has been this AI LLM stuff, which didn't exist 5 years ago, right? And so managing a programming career is all about figuring out what technology you want to jump to next and going there, or deciding I'm tired of jumping to the next technology. I want to move to the management track, or I want to move to something else, or go to school and do something else, or whatever, right? But it's unlikely that someone's going to be able to have a 30 or 35 or 40 year career working on the same kind of technology. So the project to project mindset works pretty well for that, as far as I'm concerned. I have had conversations with those folks that have been working on the mainframe. The mainframe at that location got turned off. There are no other mainframes in that city that you run that operating system that have jobs open. And they're like, that's all I've done for the last 20 years. I don't know what to do for a living, right? And I've always been terrified of being that person.
What other books you got for us, Carl?
All right, so let me give you a couple of quick ones. So this is the original Programming Perl book. It's not a bad book, but the main thing that I want people to take from this is there's a chapter in this on the philosophy of software. And the guy that wrote Perl, Larry Wall, who was brilliant, he said basically the 3 programmer virtues were impatience, laziness, and hubris. And basically the idea was put yourself in a mindset where you want to automate things, you hate things that are tedious, you want to take pride in your work. And whether you end up in Perl or not, I found those to be really, really useful, mindsets to be doing programming stuff. This book might be useful for you guys.
Speed reading.
Oh, cool.
I got this one in college. It helps a lot. I don't do everything that's in this. The main thing that's useful about this book is explaining, basically read a chapter, take notes on what was important in that chapter to you, and that helps you recall and it helps you remember the thing that was in that chapter and then go to the next chapter. But I will give you like links to all of these, so don't worry about.
Oh, thanks a ton.
Oh, that's amazing.
This book, the 7 Habits of Highly Effective People, the main thing I got from this book, I had it for ages and ages, is a thing called the Eisenhower quadrants, which is basically about dividing all of your tasks up into, is it important or not, and is it urgent or not, and focusing on things that are important, like from a long-term, things that are going to make things better in the long term, but are not urgent. Trying to avoid the problem of the day and focus on the things that are going to make things better long term, right? The tasks that will make, the tasks that will get you more time back later. And that has been a huge use. Couple for you guys. So there was a podcast where you were talking about the design of everyday things, and about how if the user, if the user doesn't understand the thing, it's not the user's fault, it's your fault.
There's no concept of user error. Right.
This is a great book about that. It's specifically in a web context, but it's a great book about lots and lots of pictures and examples about that we've largely lost in the last 15 years. This is an early web design book.
This is Don't Make Me Think by who?
By Steve Krug. Krug.
Okay. I'd love to take a look at that one because I have such an appreciation for good user design and I don't have an eye for it at all. And so getting a lot of good concrete examples would be fascinating.
Okay. So these 2 are for you. This is Database in Depth by CJ Date. CJ Date wrote a giant book on early database relational database stuff that you don't want to get into. But this specifically is database relational theory for people that are practitioners of databases. And it's actually more interesting than you think. And then this book, SQL for Smarties, is mostly, there's a whole series of these, and they're mostly SQL examples. It's kind of like a SQL cookbook.
Oh, that'd be great.
And they are fantastic. The one on trees and hierarchies is a mind blower if you ever end up doing that kind of thing. So this is a great series.
Perfect.
Let me do this one. Problem Frames by Michael Jackson, but not that Michael Jackson. This is the closest that I've ever found to a book on debugging.
Interesting.
It's really good. I don't remember how old this is. It's not new, but it's 2001. It's a really good book on like how to think about the problem, how to think about what might go into the problem, how to form hypotheses, that kind of stuff. So this is a really good, very practical book on how do you debug systems and that kind of thing. I've got more over here, but I don't know how long we want to go.
I think we got a few minutes left.
Okay. So these two, I don't know how much people want to read these, but this is Learning to Classify Text Using Support Vector Machines. This is This is actually a really good book. This is from like 2005, maybe. I'm trying to remember. But this is the way that the current AI LLM stuff takes sentences and things and turn them into vectors so that then they could do operations on them, right? This is a 20-year-old book, right? So a lot of this LLM stuff is not as new as everybody wants to pretend it is. And then this book is fantastic. It is Understanding Deep Learning by Simon J.D. Prince. I will send you a link. There's actually an interview with him on a channel called Machine Learning Street Talk or something like that, where he talks about this book. This book is really, really good. It's really hard to get through. I shouldn't say that. It's very dense. But if you really, really want to understand the state of the art as of a couple of years ago in LLMs and stuff, this is a great book for that.
That's fantastic.
I'm not quite all the way through that one yet. I'm having to go back up and reread things to make sure I understand it.
You had mentioned a book you wanted to cover. This was before we started recording, about technical communication.
Yes. Excuse me. That book I have up here is called Driving Technical Change by Terrence Ryan. Unfortunately, I don't have that in a physical copy. I had it. I can't find it. I think I lent it to someone, which is not an unusual thing for me. It's from the Pragmatic Programmers imprint. And it is a book on communication between groups, but specifically purposeful communication for the purpose of you want to get something done. You've got other groups, you've got other people in your group that you're working with. You've got other groups that have different incentives that you're working with. How do you get everybody on the same page? How do you prove to people that your idea is right? I think you said something on an earlier episode about the like reversible decisions and about how you want to create the two-way door decisions.
Yeah.
And you wanted to create like a sample repository, and you wanted to like move a sample, move one project to it, and then make sure that worked out and that kind of stuff. It's stuff like that. Like, how do you prove to other groups that the direction that you want everybody to go is one that will work for them, and get slow buy-in and that kind of thing. It's really, really good for that kind of stuff.
Well, that's fantastic. Thank you for sharing all these books with us. We might have to have you back again, because I know we only got through not even half the ones you had.
So let's see.
Yeah.
It's amazing.
I have a few.
For our audio listeners, he's showing us his wraparound bookshelves.
I love it.
Well, that is
one
fantastic.
day. See, I have this, and so it's going to have to expand across my room.
Well, any parting thoughts for our listeners about the importance of reading?
Like I said earlier, there are concepts that I don't know how to get across in video format. That's not to say it's impossible, but I haven't seen. I even haven't, a lot of these, I haven't seen videos with that. And if you wanted to make a video that explains some of the stuff in these books as well as they do, it would take a lot of work in a lot of animation, something like a 3 blue, 1 brown kind of thing. And I don't know that it would be worth it for people to actually do that. And it's a lot easier for someone to write a book, especially us old farts, to write a book and to explain things that way. And there are concepts that are just really, really hard to get across any other way. And if those are the concepts that you're interested in, if those are things that you think you need to know or you want to expand your mind, I don't know of a medium that's better. And especially for the stuff that requires a combination of text and pictures and that kind of thing. I know you had a guest on that talked about audiobooks, and I've listened to several of those, but audiobooks for programming, I've never gotten not a good feel for. So they're just things that are useful to know that I don't know how else to get that idea across.
Well, I mean, we found the same thing, right? And we've just found the benefit of engaging with long form ideas. We're reading right now Looks Good to Me by Adrian Berganza. It's in early access
code
right
review
now.
one?
It's all all about code reviews, right? And it's one of those things where you think you understand code reviews, and I still think I do understand code reviews, but there's something about spending a long time, spending a week or two constantly reflecting on an idea and really engaging with it that lets your mind explore the space a little.
And Carter, I think this is a thing that would separate like your experience professionally from like what Carl and I, because I've been in a bunch of startups too. You don't know, you take for granted infrastructure and design patterns that have been made before you're there until you actually have to do it yourself, right? Like when you are the 4 engineers or 3, or sometimes you're the 1 engineer and you're like, oh, I have to make this process myself. It can be disorienting and you have to make a lot of decisions. And some of those decisions have very long, like far reaching consequences. And it might've been something you did on a Friday. You didn't think about it. And you're like, wait a second, I didn't deliberately do this. And now we've hired 4 people and now it's a mess because, so yeah.
Well, thanks a ton for joining us, Carl. It was really such a pleasure having you on, and thank you for being a fan of the podcast. It's always fun to hear people reference some of the stuff we've done because you make content, you send it out into the void, and it's good when the void calls back a bit.
Yes, it's being a YouTube creator is its own thing. I am learning that the hard way.
Well, thanks everyone for tuning in. You can find Carl on his his YouTube channel, Internet of Bugs. You can find us on YouTube as well. We're Book Overflow. I think the handle's Book Overflow Pod. You can find us on Twitter at Book Overflow Pod. You can find me on Twitter at Carter Morgan. Are you on Twitter, Carl, or anywhere?
I am not on Twitter anymore. I'm on Mastodon at Carl Brown without the last O.
Okay.
At Mastodon.social.
And then Nathan, you can find him functionallyimperative.com. That's going to be the source of truth for all of his other interviews that he does. Thanks so much for tuning in, everyone. And thank you again, Carl, for joining us. It was really such a pleasure having you.
Thanks for having me.